hang up on all of us, we'll know why.
Yeah, exactly.
Greg, I love the mountains in the background there. Can't really see you, but can see those mountains.
That was the plan.
Yeah.
Hey, I had talked to, go ahead.
Hey, Dylan.
Yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
If I want to mute the YouTube sound, but not our Zoom meeting, how do I do that?
I wouldn't mess with that. I would just say you're live now on YouTube, and let's let Missy now post it on the site, because I don't think we want to try missing anything that could disconnect the connection. Is that what you were wondering? Because right now we are live on YouTube, and Missy's about to post this onto our. She's going to post the link that will embed it on our FWP page.
We've got a phone number up here, Charlie. Can't remember who that is with the last 4 digits of 8002. Who has a phone number with the last 4 digits of 8002?
Hey, Heather, that's me, Hillary.
Oh, hi, Hillary. Are you able
Hi.
to change your name so that we don't have your phone number up there?
It's weird because on my computer it does show my name. So let me mess around here.
Okay.
It's weird.
I see your name and I see your phone number.
Oh, that's because my audio is on my phone. Okay, let me.
Morning, Ken.
Good morning. Okay, yeah, just let us all know when we're live and then she can start. Okay.
Michelle.
I know I'm having camera. Hi there, guys. I'm having camera issues
Right.
again. Let me just see if I've hit the switch.
Well, thanks.
No, it seems to be working.
See, Michelle joined us. Cool.
Got a full house plus one on the way with Kristen.
So we're getting loaded to the site right now, and it should be live any second here, and I'll let you know.
Well, good morning, everyone. And for those that are just joining us, if you're able to turn your camera on for council members, we were talking about how it's really nice to see everybody. And certainly if you need to get up, take a break, you can turn it off, or if your bandwidth is slowing down, you can go ahead and turn it off. We're gonna give this a try this morning just to see if we can make that a little bit more personable. And there's gonna be a lot of discussion, and folks were saying it's a little easy discussion with each other when we can see each other. So let's give that a try and see how that goes. So we are live, and want to say welcome everyone to this morning's meeting. We've had a number of video meetings in the last couple of weeks, so I want to say thank you for dedicating additional time that we hadn't scheduled previous to COVID pandemic, but this has certainly of being able to meet, have additional conversation on the discussions that certain topic area around the role of hunting. a little bit of a description. So we'll start with Annie. Good morning.
Work for about half the year in the as a natural.
We have property.
Thanks, Brett. Caroline.
Caroline Bird in Bozeman, 7 years and for about 13 years. So
good morning, thank you.
Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Montana and between.
Good morning.
Max, I live in Helena, Montana.
I work for Montana State University.
Hi, I'm Erin.
I'm Greg Schock from up at the heart of.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Heath Martinell.
I work for Swan Valley Connections and involved in wildlife education and preserving and having some good discussions.
Southwest Montana, and happy to be.
Yeah, model rancher in South Central Montana.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle. I am a retired school teacher in Montana.
Nick.
Hi, I'm Nick G, and I work for the Montana Wildlife Federation. I'm based in our headquarters.
Bradley. My husband, the Blackfeet Reservation Bears.
Oops.
King. I live in the Cabinet Yak, and I am the director of the Yak Valley Forest Council.
Kristen, are you us? Introduce ourselves and for introductions for council members. And if you missed any of that, or if you want them, they're more full bios on each website, which is fwp.mt.gov Bear Advisory Council. So, and read those. I want to introduce myself. My name's Heather. I co-facilitate the Governor League, Sean Johnson. We're with Montana through the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy. And thank the support team that is supporting the council. We've got members from Sperry, Rich Harris, Ken McGill, Gary Bertololi, Bill Shank, Dylan YouTube channel, which I understand is working indie right now, but this is being recorded, so I don't think that folks are going to be missing anything. You'll just have to maybe rewind or go back. Dylan Tabish will also be monitoring public comments and questions as we have this meeting. And so we'll do our best as time allows to entertain some of those questions as they come in or towards the end. So please do know that if you submit questions during this time, Dylan will be monitoring that. We've got Craig Glazier and Hillary Cooley, Jody Bush with the support team. We've got Chris Savage and Scott Jackson from U.S. Forest Service. We've got Mike Madel, one of our bear managers from the Rocky Mountain Front. Dale Becker and Stacy Corville from Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes, and Lauren Monroe from Blackfeet Tribe. So just want to say thank you to all of you. We've also got Sarah Silty, who helps us with taking minutes and also provides some great additional information around education and outreach. We've also got Mark Haroldson, who has been really great in helping with data around Yellowstone area. So I hope I'm not leaving anyone else out, but we're really, really grateful to the support team for always being available during our meetings and in between as well. So again, welcome everyone to this meeting. Again, welcome public folks. We do have the agenda up on the website, as well as documents that our presenters sent to the council so that you have access to them as well, and they'll remain on the website. Also want to share that all public comments are available to council members. They have been reading them. We understand that about 700 have come in within the last 48 to 72 hours. I don't think council members have gotten to all of those just yet, but they are dedicated to reading those, and they will also be available to the public on the website as Dylan is looking at collating those and putting those up every month, depending upon if you have questions but you want to contribute to help inform the council's recommendations and ideas in moving forward, but also. So this morning, as I mentioned, social acceptance. This is a theme that's up since the very terms of talking about Grizzly in the state of Montana, and what does that look like throughout the state, and why does that vary? And so we have esteemed colleagues from the University of Montana, Alex Metcalf and Libby Metcalf and Holly Nesbitt, and I'll let them introduce themselves, and just so that you are all clear about how we're really framing this discussion, because it can go in a number of different ways, and certainly we could spend hours and days talking about this. The guiding questions that we're really trying to set the stage for conversation this morning are around what is social acceptance? What does that mean in the context of grizzly bear conservation and management within the state of Montana? How does social acceptance look in various locations across the state, and how has it changed over time? And what are the factors that build social acceptance and harm social acceptance? So these are three really big questions. Alex, Libby, and Holly are with us for about an hour this morning. I don't know how deep we'll be able to get into all of this, but they're certainly going to share their research, their experience, and help set some structure around this conversation between council members. And please, if you're not speaking, if you can put yourself on mute, that would be helpful. So Alex and Libby and Holly, I'm going to turn it over to you guys for introduction and beginning the conversation.
Hi all, thank you for having us here today. We're just going to quickly introduce ourselves, and then we can turn it back over to me, and I'll kind of talk about the rest of our morning together. I'm Libby Metcalf. I'm an associate professor at the University of Montana in the College of Forestry and Conservation, and I'm part of the social science unit within that college that focuses on how humans interact with natural resources. And my work predominantly has focused on wildlife-related interactions.
Yeah, and I am Alex Metcalf, and our children are downstairs. We might get interrupted by that at any moment. We just heard some disruption brewing. But I'm an assistant professor in the same college, College of Forestry and Conservation at here in Missoula. I teach in the Resource Conservation Program and the newly launched Environmental Science and Sustainability Program. And I do a lot of work with private landowners on conservation issues. And then I think Holly's on, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hey everyone, I'm Holly Nesbitt. I'm a PhD student in Alex and Libby's lab, and I was one of the people helping design the grizzly bear survey that went out.
Great. So today I think we're going to focus on three big areas, and we're going to talk maybe for about 15 or so minutes, and then we'll open it up for question and answer. And so we'll try to get through our 15-minute presentation as rapidly as we can, so we can allow for enough time for dialogue and discussion. And so I'm going to discuss some basic definitions and terms. I'm going to turn it over to Holly, who's going to talk about some drivers of acceptance and tolerance. And then Alex is going to finish us off by talking about how attitudes change or don't change over time, and then give an update on our survey that we have that we've been doing with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And so that's kind of our little agenda for today. And like Alex said, we have two Zoom bombers in our house that are 3 and 5 years old, and they will come into this room as soon as I start talking. So just be patient with us as we navigate working from home with our two very small children. Okay, so I guess I'd like to open it up with studying people is a very, very challenging task if you haven't realized this. And so that is the world that Holly and Alex and I work in, is trying to understand why people behave the way they behave. And it's easier to do in controlled settings, like so thinking about psychologists and lab experiments, that seems a little easier. But when you get into the real world situation of dealing with wildlife and natural resource issues, it makes it really, really hard to understand why people behave and act the way that they do. And so observing people is challenging. And so it's also can be sometimes creepy watching people do what they do. And so we often rely on things that are not observable. And the things that we really think are important as scientists are those underlying attitudes, values, and beliefs that people hold when they're thinking about wildlife issues. one of those unobservable things that we often find ourselves thinking about in the context of wildlife is this idea of social tolerance. And there's not a lot of agreement in the academic world about what social tolerance is, how we define it, or how we measure those things. And so there's just a lot of debate that's going on. And so the things that I imagine that you guys are wrestling with are the very same things that are being wrestled with on in the academic world. So social tolerance is what I'm going to focus on today, is a word that we see a lot. Wildlife agencies use it. It shows up in policies. And so there's policies all over the nation focused on social tolerance of wildlife. And it's often discussed as something that we need to increase. And so, but it's a complex and tricky concept to really kind of entangle and think about. So tolerance has been defined in a couple different ways. And so I'm going to describe those ways and then talk about what I think the way tolerance should be defined. So first off, tolerance is often defined as an attitude. And so when we think about an attitude, it's a favorable or unfavorable or positive or negative evaluation or judgment of a thing. So your attitude towards a particular wildlife species as being favorable or unfavorable. A belief is another way that we define tolerance. And so that's something, how something ought to be or should be. It's sometimes based in acceptance, or it could also be based in somebody's value. And the last way that we think about social tolerance is as a behavior. And so are those actions associated with actively living with a particular species, whether that be positive interactions or negative interactions, those all kind of come under this idea of social tolerance. I like to simplify the idea of social tolerance a little bit and just simply define it as putting up with something just putting up with something you don't like. And so that definition resonates with me as I think about how social tolerance works with wildlife species. A lot of times we're often putting up with something that we don't like. I see social tolerance as a combination of acceptability. So Heather introduced this idea as understanding social acceptance. I think that's one piece of understanding tolerance, but I also think we need to understand those underlying attitudes as well. And so in the document that we sent to you, there are human dimensions of wildlife primer that we put together. You'll see a typology, a kind of a grid that has acceptability on one side and attitudes on the other side. And that's one way you can conceptualize what we mean by social tolerance. The other word that we often see thrown about is this idea of coexistence. And so coexistence is slightly different than tolerance. And in fact, coexistence has less agreement around the definition than social tolerance does, but it's often has a little bit more about peaceful coexistence or living peacefully with one another. And so you can still in the coexistence definitions remain rivals or adversaries, but oftentimes what we're trying to achieve when we're thinking about management of wildlife species, it's really that idea of social tolerance and not so much that coexistence yet. And so I guess we wanted to tell you that piece of this just so we're all using similar terminology. But I think the bigger thing is that you guys can define these terms as any way you want to fit your needs. And so you shouldn't, just because we're defining it in certain ways in the literature, we're wrestling with it in certain ways of the literature, you guys are free to define your own term and make it your own definition as well. And so now I'm going to punt it over to Holly, who's going to talk a little bit about some of those drivers of social tolerance that you guys might be wrestling with.
Thanks, Libby. Yeah, so as Libby said, I'm going to go over some of the characteristics of individual people that might lead to tolerance or acceptance of large carnivores. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of research on attitudes towards grizzly bears in particular. And so the studies that I'm pulling from are about other large carnivores like black bears and wolves and coyotes. So, take this with a grain of salt. This is what we know about other species, and it may very well apply to grizzly bears, but grizzly bears could also be different because one of the things we do know is that people do respond differently to different species, as I'm sure you're all very, very much aware. So if you want to follow along with me, I'm going to go on page. I'm just going to kind of give a loose overview starting on the second page of the primer that we sent out.
Just to remind the public that those documents are on the website. And Holly, can you just reiterate the name of that document, please?
Yeah, it's the Human Dimensions of Wildlife Primer. So one of the things that we often hear is that we really need to improve our outreach or our public education, and then that would improve tolerance, or then people would secure bear attractants, or then people would use bear spray if they only knew about bear spray. But it turns out that just because people know about something or know about an issue, it doesn't necessarily mean it will change their how they think about an issue, and it won't necessarily change how they might behave. And so the equation is a lot more complicated than that. Apparently humans are complex beings. And so one of the things that we do know from studying social tolerance of natural hazards, which is now being applied to large carnivores, is that tolerance is largely driven by how people perceive the risks and the benefits of that hazard, or in this case, of a carnivore. And those perceptions of risks and benefits are driven by things like how much an individual person feels that they have personal control over the risk, how much they trust the responsible agency for managing that species, and what their emotional reaction is towards that species. And all of these characteristics of an individual interact with one another to determine what their acceptance or their tolerance of that large carnivore is. And so it's not easy to pull one lever or the other, because they're all these different aspects are interacting with one another. Another thing that social scientists have studied is not just how people feel towards carnivores, but how people feel towards carnivore management. So characteristics of individuals, like whether they believe they have shared values with an agency, whether they trust the agency, what their beliefs and attitudes towards the specific species is, and how they emotionally react to that species with either fear or excitement. All those things drive whether or not a person might support agency management decisions. And then the last thing that I'll just quickly mention is this idea of imposition and locus of control. Locus of control is a belief that people hold about whether the state that they are personally in is due to their own factors that they can control, or due to outside forces. And those outside forces can be things like fate, but they can also be powerful interest groups. And so based on some work out of Norway with sheep farmers, when those farmers felt like their situation with carnivores was being imposed on them by outside forces, they tended to have negative attitudes towards carnivores, and then less acceptance of those carnivores. But when they felt like they had control over their situation, they had more positive attitudes towards the carnivores and then tended to be more accepting of them. So, all of these individual characteristics, risk and benefit perception, attitudes, beliefs, trust, emotions, personal control, they all come together, and you can kind of see why tolerance can be a pretty complicated and muddy topic, because it varies so much by individual, and all of these different characteristics that are within every individual. And with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thanks, Holly. That was great. So I think what you're starting to see is that we use this word tolerance or acceptability to mean something, but it's not a very specific term. And so I think what we would like to encourage you to do is to think about exactly what is the thing that would define success. And that we often use tolerance to kind of be that thing, but we have to be a little more specific about what we mean. Do we mean an attitude? Do we mean people's attitudes towards bears? Do we mean people's behaviors toward bears, either positive or negative? Do we mean their acceptance of management actions by the agency? And the things that drive, that end state, that goal, will differ depending on whether it's an attitude or a behavior or acceptability that you're aiming for. A couple things to keep in mind. We were thinking about all the things we could talk about. We're like, we need all of you like in our lab for a couple of years and then we'll maybe get there. But so in 40 minutes, we were thinking about kind of a couple key concepts that we thought would be important to convey. The first is that lots of attitudes are tricky things. And we tend to think about attitudes as changing quickly, as, you know, a goal is often to change people's attitudes. But a general rule of thumb is that attitudes do not change very easily at all. There are a couple exceptions to that, but what we find is that attitudes that are based in personal experience, that are tied deeply to people's values, are generally tend toward consistency. So attitudes are hard things to change. I think a couple of those exceptions might apply to grizzly bears, because we have places that are increasing, you know, their interaction with bears. Like that is a place where people's attitudes could change based on that direct experience. And there are places in the state where people just haven't thought about this before. And so their attitudes aren't deeply formed yet. That can change quickly. And so as people start to interact with bears, interact with other people who have interacted with bears, and their attitudes start to connect to their values and the things that they hold dear, those attitudes can very quickly solidify, and then it's very, very hard to change them. Changing attitudes is not always the goal though, or it's not always necessary. So if your goal is more behavior oriented, we often think that changing someone's attitude is the key to changing their behavior, and that's almost always not the right way to go. Lots of things drive people's behaviors. Attitudes, in order to engage in a behavior, you have to have a somewhat positive attitude toward that generally, but just having a positive attitude toward it doesn't mean you actually engage in that behavior. There's lots of other factors. And so two of those factors that we wanted to highlight to you are one, just the power of social norms, which are the things that people see people like them doing. If everyone you know engages in a particular behavior, there's a strong influence on you to engage in that behavior as well. And we don't like to admit that as humans, but we see that over and over. And the other piece of that is that we are fairly responsive to what we think other people think we should do. And so those are really powerful forces in driving people's behaviors that we see in a variety of different contexts. In some instances, behaviors are also controlled by whether we think we can actually get something done. And that can be a perceived barrier, something I just don't have the time. I don't think I have the time. I don't think I have the money. Or it can be, that's actually true. I don't have the resources to get this done. And so in different instances, there are different barriers in people's way. And so to kind of achieve an objective, you have to identify what that specific barrier is in that context and address that particular thing. And attitudes are almost always not the thing. And then the last thing is that if people being happy is your objective, that the things that Holly was talking about related to trust and related to public engagement in decision-making, those are the things that we see really drive satisfaction. Whether people feel like they've had an opportunity to be a part of decision-making, whether their participation in that decision-making process actually mattered, and whether they have trust in the agency, and trust is a multifaceted thing. And so, yeah, there's our 15-minute primer on human dimensions of wildlife. You are all experts now, and I'm sure there are no questions, but we will turn it over to you as we deliver and deploy snacks strategically.
Looks like the littles had some questions over there. That was really, really helpful. And I appreciate you breaking it down in terms of attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and how that can impact. And that certainly does align with a lot of the discussion that the council members have had over the last several months. Given that we've got the Metcalfs and Holly here for a good half an hour, maybe 40 more minutes, questions from council members. How does this information and what they've started to share percolate for you all and either resonate or maybe not with a lot of the thoughts and questions you've had over the last several months?
And Heather, do you want us to give an update on the survey that we've been working with FWP on now, or do you want to do that toward the end of the hour?
Why don't we go ahead and do that now? And the survey went out to what, 5,000 Montanans, and is up on the council website for folks who did not see that previously. So sure, Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So a while back, FWP approached us about a survey that they had begun working on internally. And so we've been helping them with that. And I just wanted to give an update. We were hoping to be able to share results today, but we're still working on the analysis there. And so I'll give you an update on the timeline there. But the objectives of the survey were kind of fourfold. One were to understand what actions individuals across the state were willing to take to reduce conflicts with grizzly bears and in what different contexts. The second was to understand what agency actions the public might support to reduce conflict with grizzly bears and how, of course, that varies across different scenarios. And then some of the things that Holly was talking about generally, and from other research with different species, we wanted to understand more deeply with respect to grizzly bears in Montana. And so we wanted to understand what are those drivers and what are the complex interactions that lead to public support for grizzly bear conservation, grizzly bear management, et cetera. And then lastly, an objective of the survey was to determine whether people acclimate to bears, for lack of a better way to put it. And so we're trying to see how some of these attitudes and behaviors toward grizzly bears may change based on how long and in what ways people have been interacting with grizzlies. Let's see. So yeah, Heather mentioned the survey went out to just over 5,350 addresses across Montana that were randomly selected. We wanted to survey folks who are 18 years and older. So we had a bit of a within household randomization question to begin the survey. And then the survey, as you can see, it's posted on the website, covered a variety of topics. The process that we're in right now is generating the kind of the raw responses to those survey questions. And what we want to do is do that in a way that represents the population of Montana. And that involves some weighting because we have some populations that respond more or less than others. And so we need to correct for the population that actually exists across the state. So we're in the process of doing that and reviewing that with the agency. And I assume that those numbers will be available very shortly. A little longer process is some more involved analysis of exactly what those different drivers are. So if we pull, acceptability of a particular management tool out as an objective that we want to understand, there might be a suite of drivers that determine that. And so we'll go through a more complex analysis to figure out what's actually related and how strongly. And so that's the focus of our work with Holly over the next couple months. And we hope to have a manuscript submitted to a scientific journal fairly soon. And then once that's through the peer review process, we'll be able to release those results. So happy to answer other questions on any front there. I think that's what we have. And I guess we'll close by just saying, we are, maybe we're biased, but we think this issue is almost entirely social. And we obviously can't cover all of that in this time. And so we hope that this is the beginning of a conversation with you folks as you struggle with this and as you make your recommendations and as the state of Montana continues to think about how to achieve whatever goals we decide are appropriate for grizzlies.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate that. And if you could certainly keep us apprised of when you're able to provide some additional updates on survey data, I know council members would be interested. So we've got a few folks raising their hands. Nick, you want to start off?
Yeah, great. This is for all three of you. I think this is outstanding research, and I'll just start off saying I remember in the mid 2000s when I heard in the hunting community, a lot of people said, you know, I don't hate wolves, I just want to see them managed. And of course, now we have a very liberal hunting season on wolves. But my question is there any indication of more acceptance for species that recolonize naturally areas rather than reintroduced? And secondly, is there any science about, you know, the hunting community and showing more support for more of those species on the landscape when there's an opportunity to hunt them?
It's a great question. And I think there's some mixed findings in the literature when I'll take the hunting one first. Some studies have shown, yes, hunting helps people feel like that behavioral control that Holly was talking about. It helps people feel that behavioral control over helping managing a species, but that's not ubiquitous across all species or all contexts. And so those are kind of just a few studies that have bubbled up. The colonization thing is really interesting. And I feel like we were just at a conference in the fall where in Colorado, where they were talking about that very thing, like, you know, wolves coming down into Colorado and people's perception of recolonization versus reintroduction. And I'm not sure anyone has explicitly looked at the acceptance with those two variables. I don't know, Alex.
Yeah, I think that's an open question. I mean, what Holly was talking about with locus of control, I think starts to intersect with this idea, where we know from a few studies that if people feel like this decision is being imposed on them, then that doesn't work out well for acceptance or tolerance. But if they feel like it's either natural or they were a part of that decision, then they are more accepting of it. But I mean, I'll let Holly disagree with me, but I feel like the amount of data that's out there and the number of studies is fairly low. You can tell that I defer to my students to keep me in line.
Yeah, I mean, I've only seen a handful of studies that have looked at the idea of locus of control and imposition in the wildlife context. But I will add that we have questions in the survey that try and get at this very question that you're asking. Both of those questions: will hunting lead to a feeling of more control and therefore a feeling of being more accepting? So we have questions that we're hoping to be able to answer exactly that. And then also we have questions about, like, do you feel like bears are coming in naturally, or do you think that bears are being imposed on you by management? And so we're hoping to be able to tackle exactly those questions that you have through the survey.
Jonathan.
Thank you. And thanks, Alex and Libby and Holly, for sharing this information. I really appreciated the grizzly bear survey that you sent. And one of the things that we've been working on as a council is how do we identify and discuss different areas of the state in relation to grizzly bear management and inhabitants. And so on your section 7 there, I see that you all have a map that's kind of identified 7 different areas. And it seems like there's a bit of a mix of, you know, biological, social, and managerial delineations there. But I was wondering if you could share any information about how you came up with those areas. And I'm hoping that maybe I'll find some value that can help us better have that discussion as well.
Yeah, let's see. We're trying to think about the best person to answer that. I think it's either Holly or Cecily. I don't know if Cecily is able to jump on, but that was the survey was, I mean, it started out as an FWP effort, and the end result was a collaboration between our lab and the agency. And so that particular question and that map came from the agency And so potentially, I'm not sure if Cecily can jump on to answer that, but that's something we can certainly get an answer to.
Yeah, I'm on, and we wanted to make a map that represents kind of the different areas related to the protected populations under the ESA, some of the areas that we expect bears to be able to move potentially between the connectivity areas. But we didn't want the map to be so specific that it hemmed into those. And we also expected that there might be members of the public that don't really have much information about recovery zones and that sort of thing. So we purposefully made the map kind of general with just different zones so that people could look at the zones themselves, kind of place themselves in those zones if they needed to, but we wanted them not to be too specific.
Thank you.
Thanks. Erin.
Yeah, thank you everybody for the presentation and the discussion. I had a question. You had mentioned acclimate or acclimation as far as bears moved out. I'm just curious in your research if you guys have come up with other species and maybe what that meant for other species and what was involved there. Was it outreach and education potentially that came ahead of it that allowed for that acclimation, or is there a little research done there? Or I'm just curious as your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Erin. Can everyone hear us? Okay, good, thank you. I don't have a quantitative study I can point to, but I've done a bunch of work with bison and gateway communities down by Yellowstone. And we did a series of 60 plus interviews with all sorts of folks in that area in Gardner and West. And the thing that kept popping up was one-on-one interaction with agencies, FWP most notably, and the range rider program that they had down there. Those type of one-on-one interactions and trust building and problem solving at a very local scale was the thing that helped people the most. It did not alleviate problems. There were still issues with bison. There were things that you hear about all the time, but the one-on-one interaction was the thing that mattered.
I think generally we see when there's some sort of new, forgive this word, but like disturbance or something
Hey, Alex,
people have
I'm
to
having
deal
a
with.
hard time hearing you guys. I don't know if anyone else is finding your mic breaking up a little bit.
It is a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on. Didn't go to review.
How's that? Is that better?
That's better. Yeah.
Okay.
This is like,
We're getting a brand new warning we've never seen before.
yeah, we've been
despite Zooming.
we Zoom like a million times with our students, and so now I feel like
Maybe they've been just not listening and it's been okay.
Yeah, they haven't been listening to us.
Just smile and nod. That's the appropriate response.
They just send snarky chats to me in the thing.
What I was saying is that we see not just with wildlife, but in all sorts of instances where people have to deal with something new, that there's generally an initial reaction, and then that tapers off. And so I'm not saying that that is the case with grizzlies, but that's kind of the basis of our hypothesis and why we wanted to collect some data to help answer that question.
There's one study that I can think of that looks at how many interactions people have had with black bears. I can't remember what state it was in, somewhere in the East.
Yeah, I think that was the Connecticut study.
Yeah, and they had mixed results. Like I can't remember exactly what the conditions were, but they had different groups basically, and one group who had interacted a lot with black bears or had many different incidents where they had black bears coming onto their property and getting into their garbage and things like that. they were more likely to secure the attractants. So like take fruit off of trees or put grills away or use bear-proof garbage cans, things like that. And then there was another group that just didn't respond to that. Like it didn't matter how many times that a black bear came onto their property. It was like, yeah, whatever. So yeah, mixed, not helpful, I guess.
Thank you. Michelle. And then Chuck, I know you have a question as well, so we'll put you in after Michelle.
Hi, thank you so much for all of your work. I am curious if you could go into a little bit further detail. You said public participation helped improve attitudes. And you also said whether that public participation made a difference. I'm wondering if you could be a little more detailed about that for us.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we see, I mean, as you guys wrestle with kind of what the objective might need to be, I think you start to realize that lots of people have different perspectives on what that is. And at the end of the day, there's no right answer. There's just the answer that we choose. And the means that we get there are also up to us. And so what we've seen in lots of studies, especially with natural resource issues, is that if people who have to live with the outcome are involved in deciding what that outcome should be and how we should get there, they are much happier with the outcome and with that process. And we see that we see involving the public take on a few different kind of paths. One is just to create lots of opportunity for comment and lots of opportunity for showing up at public meetings. But what we've started to show in a few studies recently is that, and quantify, is that just having that opportunity isn't enough. People have to be able to see how their input and their participation has actually influenced the decision or has been taken very, very seriously and been stepped through how their input was heard, but ultimately didn't change the outcome. And so like that participation in the process is, I would say, as or more important than what the decision actually is at the end of the day, in terms of whether people are going to be happy. So lots of studies on that. Most of that work is qualitative through interviews with people who've been involved in these processes all over the world. We're starting to be able to quantify that a little bit more. We could talk about that all day long.
Great, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that another sort of complicating layer is that people who tend to trust responsible agencies, for example, tend not to participate, and it's often a lack of trust that drives participation, and so that's just another layer. And maybe in some ways, maybe that's a good thing if the people that aren't trusting then are participating more and then have higher satisfaction at the end of participating in some kind of engagement or a decision. That could happen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. That's that question certainly has been part of the process that we've been very intentional and purposeful in doing our best to integrate. And I'm sure more ideas keep coming. And as we're having to change the way in which we engage the public, still wanting to hear from public and find ways to integrate what they have to say and how that continues to inform discussions. So very timely, given that we've just received 700 comments in the last 48 hours. So thanks, Michelle. Chuck.
Well, and sorry, Heather, I'll just add one thing to that.
Go ahead.
That really listening to the comments and to the people who, like, to the residents of this state and whoever will be dealing with an outcome, it's not only about making them happy, it's about making a better decision, right? We've seen it across all sorts of research that that's how you get to a better outcome, is you listen to those folks, you listen to their experiences, you hear what's going on, you modify your decisions based on that input. So it's not just about like listening and showing and making people happy. It's actually about a better outcome at the end of the day too.
Thanks, Alex. I think the council would fully support that, and I think they're doing their best to find ways to integrate that and hear and understand those experiences. Chuck.
Yes, thanks to all three of you. My question a little bit on the logistics. How were the 5,350 residents randomly selected? What did you do to do that? And how many out of the 5,350 responded to the survey? And then changing gears a little bit, your comment about we view this issue as entirely social. Could you expand on that a little bit? That really threw me in a lot of directions. Thanks.
Yeah, my pleasure. Let's see. So yeah, so there are 5,350, and there are there are companies that keep lists of all addresses in the country, and in conjunction with the Postal Service. And so what we can do is purchase a sample of randomly selected addresses. So there's, I'm looking for the number here, 800,000. Sorry. Anyway, there's a list of addresses across the state that correspond to 814,000 residents above the age of 18. And so that sample of 5,350 was selected at random from that list. And the reason we do that is so that we can then make inference to the whole state, so that we don't have a particular interest group responding heavily to a survey. We haven't selected people who care a whole lot about grizzly bears or really don't like grizzly bears. We have a randomly selected survey of Montana residents distributed across the state geographically, so that we can start to make some conclusions about different regions and how grizzly bear distributions start to interact with people's attitudes and behaviors. And my comment that this is
I told him I'm not touching it. He can touch it.
If I didn't say it before, I'll say almost entirely social. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the decisions that Montana makes about whether grizzly bears should be here, where they should be, and how we live with them are decisions that we have to make as a people together. And so that is an entirely social decision. And how we get from where we are now to whatever objective we decide collectively to reach will take us working together. And certainly there's biophysical realities here, and grizzly bears are different than other species, and that's not to be discounted. But whether or not Montanans are happy with grizzly bears or coexist with grizzly bears or simply tolerate grizzly bears is a social process that has lots of biophysical pieces, but the social is very important. So I probably overstated it, but that's what I do.
Thanks. I kind of guessed that's the direction you were headed. But how many respondents out of the 5,350?
It was 39%.
39. Okay.
Which is very good. That might seem like a low number, but it's good.
No way of knowing how that was spread geographically over the state, or can you narrow that down?
Yeah. Yep, that's exactly what the kind of weighting that we're doing right now is, to see where people responded, where they didn't, how that was related to some other demographic factors, and to try to correct for if there's any unevenness to that. As we start to generate our numbers, we've corrected for those things. So that's what's taking time right now.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Brett.
Thank you. Two questions. Chuck asked one of them, but so I got another one for you. So when were the surveys put out, and when can we expect to see the results of that?
Yeah, so the survey went out at the
Sorry, in fall.
Yeah, last fall.
Yeah.
Yeah, last fall, the last round of surveys went out, I think January 2nd. So it was late fall and early in this year. And so there's kind of two waves of results that we envision. The first is just like, what percentage of Montanans believe X, Y, or Z, or have a particular attitude. That those results should be forthcoming fairly shortly, I would imagine within the next few weeks. And then the more complex analysis of what actually drives attitude A or B, that's going to take a couple months.
Thank you.
Robin, do you still have a question?
Yes, thank you. And thanks for that great presentation. It's kind of a comment, and there may be a question that emerges out of this, but that particular piece about the public participation is very helpful to me, because I live in the Cabinet Yaak ecosystem, and right now I'm hearing in our community how they're feeling a little bit disenfranchised from the original process about what it would mean to have a recovery zone in our area. And what I find very helpful about how you're framing this this discussion has given me some things to take back to the community to talk about how we can make sure this doesn't get derailed into sort of a negative place, but that we can start as a community to rebuild that trust and understanding about what a recovery zone is and what having bears in our landscape are going to look like. So I just want you to know already, that's very helpful, what I heard today from y'all. I think one of the things, me as a council member, that I'm really interested in and still struggling with a bit is how do we figure out ways to, you know, I like that idea about attitudes are hard to change. You know, what you said is, but it's how we engage our communities and are there recommendations that we can make to strengthen that engagement and to give the agency the support that they need to be reaching out. So not really a question, just a comment about how helpful this is being in driving my thoughts about how I'm going to participate going forward. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Robin. Caroline.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think we're all kind of, I don't want to be redundant because there's been some great questions, and we're really grappling with this, obviously, because this idea of socially acceptable is key to our recommendations and how they're accepted and whether they're going to work or not. And that's that definition of what's socially acceptable is a big part of, you know, whether it's biologically and socially acceptable. And the idea that that's both changeable and somewhat fixed, and that of course there is this giant range of opinions as to whether grizzly bears are going to be tolerated in Montana. And I think that's right. We're grappling with this idea that we'll have grizzly bears on the landscape if people say that's okay, if people decide that we're willing to live with bears. But so as we try to grapple with that and to define what is socially acceptable as with something that is a moving target, and how do we accommodate that range of acceptable and unacceptable, and looking at how intense it is to survey that and monitor that kind of moving target of social acceptability. Where is the sweet spot for us to say, and for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to make these decisions about, like, okay, where have we reached social acceptability throughout the state? Where can we say, yes, we've got tolerance for bears? how do we build that tolerance if that's what we decide is what we need to do through education and all of that. So I'm sorry, this is a very, it's such a big topic, but how are we going to get our hands around kind of measuring and monitoring and building that social acceptance moving forward when it is a moving target? And I go here, so here's the gist of my question. The range, how do we grapple with the ranges, the extreme ends of socially acceptable to find that kind of sweet spot, that 80%, let's say, in the middle so that we can move forward? Does that make sense?
No. Those are all great questions. And unfortunately, I'm not sure we have the answer for you. I know, I wish we did. But I guess just to say a couple of things, you're right on. Those are the things, trying to figure out how many people do we need, or what level of acceptance or what level of tolerance do we need before we can do something. That's only a question I think the council and the public can really answer, along with the agency. And so I don't know how to fully say anything to that. I think you also brought up another thing which I'm keen on, which is monitoring. And so, this is a one snapshot of a survey. People change, and so continuously understanding how attitudes and acceptability are changing over time is something that's just critical with any of our major species that are attracting a lot of discussion and conflict. And so I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of data that speak directly to that, but my gut is that this is a process, and that looking to be done is probably the wrong way to look at it. I think this is going to continue to evolve. I think having a pulse on how things are changing and being able to objectively analyze like what's leading to good outcomes and what's undermining good outcomes, like that's something we do all the time intuitively, but when we actually get into the data, we start to find some surprising results. And so I think there's a need for that kind of monitoring. We don't have to do it, but I think that's really important. And to think of this as an ongoing process and a conversation that happens in all of those places across the state. The answers in one part of the state are going to differ, but whatever system gets put in place for dealing with this has to deal with that variation and not try to come up with a one-size-fits-all approach.
Thanks. That was a good and a tough question. I appreciate you attempting to answer it as best as you can. And it is certainly something that the council has been struggling with and really wanting to understand in terms of lessons learned from various communities where there are grizzly bears, and it seems that there is higher acceptance of that coexistence piece, and areas where there's not, and how to understand that as they move forward with their recommendations. I know that you guys have another meeting to run to. We've got time for one more question. So Trina, you were next in line.
Okay, hi. I'll try to make this short. Thanks for being here. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we're talking about social tolerance and social acceptance and all that jazz. So I have a ranch on the Rocky Mountain front, and we have tons of bears here. I grew up 10 miles south of here where we've always had bears, even when there weren't any anywhere. So as I explain to people how it feels to live here and try to raise livestock with these bears and try to raise families with these bears, I tell people that we're surviving in spite of the bears. We're not coexisting, we're not tolerant, we're none of those things. We're just making a living and adjusting the way that we do things because we have no other choice. So my question to you guys is, as social scientists, how do I convey that message without looking like a jerk to people that don't live here?
Well, again, you guys are asking a bunch of tough questions that I don't think we can answer. But I mean, I think you're doing it. You are telling your story from your experience. And I think that's what we can do, right? Is to honestly share the experiences that we have, the feelings that we have, the things we've done and how they've worked out, and to work through that together. And, if someone fully disagrees with you and thinks you're a jerk no matter what, there's not much you can do about that. But to be an honest, broker of your story and your experiences, and encouraging other people to share theirs as well. This is tough, but I think that's the way. I don't know. I'm not sure that's a good answer to your question, but that's my initial reaction.
Thank you.
Thanks, Trina. There has been a lot of discussion around sharing stories and telling stories. And so I appreciate the question, Trina, and the answer, Alex. And I think that that's what this council has been put together for, is 18 very diverse in terms of experience, in terms of geography, in terms of interests, bringing all of these stories together to really broaden that realm of understanding different perspectives. And so thanks for bringing that up. I know, Libby and Alex, you guys have to run to another meeting. This conversation certainly will continue today and beyond today, and you both have been very generous with your time this morning and have indicated that you're open to hearing from council members individually, and certainly as you are able to share additional results from the survey, we'd love to bring you back. So thank you for that, and thank you for continuing to keep us posted on that. Any last words from Libby or Alex? And I think, Holly, you said you were going to stay on. So if you want to continue to listen in and convey messages or be available for questions that you might be able to answer, that would be helpful.
Thank you guys so much for this opportunity. And we're really excited about the council, and we're happy to help wherever we can.
Yeah, thank you for having us, and thanks for your work on this.
And thanks for your flexibility with having kiddos at home too. So I know there's a lot to
Somehow
jump
it worked out.
Yeah.
I don't want to go downstairs and see what's there.
I was really hoping they were going to come by with the big teddy bears and give us a show. I'm actually going to have to drop off as well. But yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for having us, and good luck with the rest of your conversations today.
Thank you, Holly. Very, very helpful. And thank you for the documents as well. Those were really helpful in structuring some of this conversation. So I'm sure we'll be in touch. And I know council members often reach out to the presenters afterwards. So we'll share your information with them. So thanks again. Yeah. And so what we'll do, we're about 5 minutes early, but we had scheduled a break for 5 minutes. And so if people want to go ahead and take a 5-minute break, we'll resume at 10:15. Welcome back, folks. We'll go ahead and resume our discussion here. If folks, council members could turn their videos back on once you guys are back, that would be helpful, just so that I know who's back and who's still needing to take some time. Thank you. Thanks for a great discussion. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but certainly want to continue the discussion here for the next hour, both around social tolerance, social acceptance, trying to determine which terminology you guys want to use and how you're defining that, and how the information is starting to resonate. I think the questions that were able to get directed to Holly and Alex and Libby were helpful in getting a sense of where your heads are right now and how that's starting to integrate into the emerging ideas and thoughts you have in moving forward. So we also want to continue the role of hunting discussion, and the two, I think, are in terms of the questions that were being asked last week during our meeting. I want to offer an opportunity for you guys to talk about both in whether they're integrated or separate, but certainly this next hour and a half is really about council discussion and where are you? And I thought that the best way to do this, so that we can really hear where each one of you is to go around and just hear a quick thought or reflection. And I'm going to go in alphabetical order, just because that's easiest for me to go through the list, to just hear a thought or reflection in terms of how you're starting to integrate and absorb the information and how this is starting to inform where your ideas are going in overall recommendations. It could be specific to one or two, or just the general process. But given that we haven't been able to hear from each one of you in the last meeting, and some of you haven't had a chance to speak up yet this morning, I thought it would be great to hear where each of you are. So I'm going to go in alphabetical order, and Annie, that means starting with you. And if you want me to come back to you, I'd be happy to do that.
Yes, please. I need a minute to get my mind around the question. So,
okay. So what I would do with that is that when you're ready, please raise your hand, right? And so, but that'll just help me track so that I don't leave anyone out. Brett. Brett, you're still on mute.
Can you repeat the question?
I want to just hear sort of where your thoughts, reflections are from the discussion this morning and the discussion from last week around the role of hunting. How are you starting to absorb and integrate the information, and how's that starting to inform your thoughts around recommendations and where we are in the process?
For hunting, you mean? Is that what you're talking about?
For hunting, for social acceptance, these are the two of the main areas that you guys were wanting more opportunity to really talk about and start to flush out. Where are each one of you around this, and how do we start digging into these more tenuous issues? So, yeah.
Okay, I think with the, I think social acceptance is just so, I'm still trying to wrap my head around that, as far as, I think I know what it means for me. I'm not sure what it means for Trina. I'm not sure what it means for some other people. So I'm still trying to grasp at that a little bit about, we kind of always believe that all wildlife has a place on our properties. But you also have to really consider the people that are guests on your property and the people that are working on your properties, and how do you go about protecting them and making sure that they're safe while they're there, and what does that mean to the landscape, as far as wildlife. And so I kind of struggle with that a little bit still. As far as hunting, I think it's a tool that is necessary. I don't think that it needs to be something that necessarily happens anytime in the immediate future, but I don't think it needs to be something that has to be left out of the toolbox. I think we need to give our biologists all of the tools that they need to do the jobs that they need to do.
Thanks, Brett. So what I heard you say around social acceptance in terms of what it means to you and how you're thinking about your operations and your ranch is really around human safety. And so in this question, I'd like everyone to also think, yes, what does it mean to you and your experience? And then how does that translate to the rest of the state as you're thinking about this process? And what I heard you, Brett, say was that you're really still wanting to get that understanding from other folks. And in terms of hunting, it being more of a management tool, is that how you're thinking about it in terms of the role and it being an option?
Yeah, I think it's a management tool. I don't necessarily think it's a, I've read some of the comments that it's a sport, or that it's, you're looking at trophy hunting, and you can call it whatever you want to call it. I don't think that we need to have directed hunts. I'm a little opposed to going into somebody's place and saying, okay, that's the bear we want you to take out. I'm against that part, but it's, but I think, based on what I'm seeing on our ranch, what I'm hearing that's happening off of the front, it appears to me that we have bears that are moving further out of the ecosystems, out of the GMAs, or the DMAs, because that's where they're full, and they need to go somewhere. And that's at least the takeaway of what I'm hearing people say, and in the comments that we've had directed to us over the past several months. So I think that tool is appropriate.
Thanks, Brett. Annie, it looks like you're ready. Oh, your hand went up. Sorry.
Yes, I'm putting my hands down. I'm trying
Okay.
to. Too many buttons.
Caroline.
I'll go after Caroline.
Well, first off, I'd say is being part of the writing team, which has been really great. I think we're getting somewhere with kind of compiling and synthesizing all the comments that the council has made. I think that there is a lot of room, there's a lot of agreement, and there's a lot of areas where we can really move forward with some solid and really helpful recommendations around which hopefully we have consensus, because that's what it feels like. And I know we'll be talking more about that later. In terms of social tolerance, social acceptance, I'm really grateful for the discussion that we just had in that presentation and the survey, and just talking about that, because I do think that it's the human component. It's the fact that it's going to be up to us. People are going to decide where, how, and whether we live with grizzly bears in Montana. And that what I struggle with is getting to that place where there is trust around the agency, there is trust around that there's good, accurate information of what's happening with the bears, because I don't think people trust the idea of where we have bears and how many bears we have and there's not enough trust around real the biology and the situation of bears on the ground. There is a lot of fear, and there are extreme ends of that social acceptance that are making their stories, the stories on the extreme are the stories on the extremes, and that there's a lot more room in the middle. And how we get to really grappling around what social acceptance is, I think that survey is going to be extremely informative, and something that we do need to keep doing to monitor where we are with social acceptance. And I think that that one point being made about so much of social acceptance comes from trust, and that those one-on-one conversations and that personal familiarity with the agency or the managers or the biologists who establish that sense of trust. That's, I don't know how helpful that is, but I think we need to keep doing what we're doing with outreach and education and informing people with good, solid, factual information, and understanding that there are a lot of voices out there, and that we need to, with the public comment and with what we're doing here, we need to make sure we're not just listening to either end of the extremes, but that we're really open to hearing all people's stories. And, you know, people call all of us, I'm sure. I certainly get calls from all kinds of people from all over the state who want their sides of the stories and their perspectives to be told. In terms of hunting, and thank you again, I thought that last presentation, the last council meeting we had around hunting was extremely informative. My sense on hunting is we're just not there yet. We still have a population that's protected under the Endangered Species Act, so it's not an option. And we're not there statewide in terms of where our different populations are and where the bears are moving. I just don't think we're ready to start talking about hunting in a way that's anything but theoretical and very much future oriented about what that might look like quite a while from now, which might be helpful, but I certainly don't think we can make any decisions about hunting in the near term. Okay, that's it. But again, I'll just say, and I know we're going to get to that, but I think we as a council, through the recommendations that we've coming up and how we're consolidating about it, I'm really optimistic.
Thanks, Caroline. Annie, you said you're ready?
I'm ready. I got all the buttons figured out. We are good. Annie Shusky from East Glacier Park. I work as an expedition leader, a naturalist, and a teacher for part of the year in Browning Public Schools. I think after the last presentation that we had, which was wonderful to get to hear, and we've all been kind of dealing with what social tolerance means, and looking at the survey that has been posted to the FWP site, I've gotten to know all 17 of you and our support staff over the last 9 months or so, but I still don't know where we all personally fall when it comes to social tolerance. And so I don't know if we just need to come out and say it more now, or if I know that's hard on a Zoom and we have time in person to have those conversations. But
that is what I'm hoping will happen like right now.
So the other thing is, though, I don't know if it would help us to take the survey that was posted and let each other see that. I think it was interesting, especially for the topic of connectivity with the map, where we feel bears are okay and not, just to kind of suss out these things that are hiding in the shadows. I myself have had some really unique opportunities in a positive way with bears, being a polar bear guide and a grizzly guide in Alaska. I have been within 10 yards of a grizzly in Alaska. I've had a polar bear come up and lick the vehicle that I was in. But I also know the danger that bears can present. I've had friends who have been mauled by bears. My dad was treed by a grizzly when we were very little. And so I try to kind of keep that not from every conversation we have, but right now we have bear tracks literally 20 yards out our door. And I know other people have bears 20 yards out their door and have a very different feel about it. I feel so immensely lucky to live in a place where I have the opportunity to see bears. And I feel I fall into the realm of social acceptance where I don't just tolerate bears or accept bears, but I try to coexist with them. And so that is my social acceptance of bears. I choose to live where I do because I know they also live here, along with mountain lions, wolves, and other large carnivores and ungulates.
Annie had told me that she was having some difficulty with her broadband. I don't know if she's... Annie, if you can hear me, if you can just type a message in the chat. We'll come back to her once she's able to sign back on. I know she's had intermittent service this morning, so we'll come back to her. Jonathan, did you have something that you wanted to add, or do you want me to go in alphabetical order, or are you just ready to go now? I see your hand raised.
I was just going with your prompt to just raise the hand.
Okay.
I wouldn't say I'm necessarily ready because it's a huge question, but I could certainly go ahead and jump on in.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was really enjoying listening to Annie's perspective there, and sorry that she got cut off. So I hope that we can get her back. Yeah, hunting and this idea of social tolerance, they seem to be fairly intertwined. It's certainly a lot of different perspectives that come into these ideas. I've got my own, as I'm sure each of us do. What's important to me, though, is really this continued, and I'm going to use the word coexistence, but not in any way that was defined by that survey or research, more just the idea of bears and humans being on a landscape together. And in the end, I think that's a positive aspect of Montana and some of our surrounding states. And the most important thing to me is that we find a durable solution, one that's resilient to change in both physical landscape and also the social landscape. To do that, it's really needs to be an adaptable solution that fits the time and place where it's applied. So there's not going to be any one size fits all quick and easy answer there. I do really respect all of the comments that we get that do really strongly portray a particular side of the story or desire. Those really help immensely to understand what the kind of cumulative social landscape and social perspective around this issue looks like. And like Caroline was saying, somewhere in the middle of all of those, I think, is where our durable solution really lies. Some of the things that go into my thoughts about what that solution looks like, something that works for bears and works for humans, is the split of public and private lands, not only here in Montana, but across the United States. And, you know, it's pretty similar. We have 40% public lands and 60% that are private, roughly. And so for any kind of sustainable grizzly bear populations, we need to be thinking about those private landowners, the ones who we are going to be relying upon to provide habitat. And that can't come at just a total cost to those folks. There need to be some sort of solutions in place that help them to be able to adapt to their particular situation. So I think that's an important consideration for me. Another one that makes it a little bit more complex when I'm thinking about hunting is the fact that here in the United States, our wildlife law and management and policy is kind of based on a long history that through which has come that North American model of wildlife management. It's going to be really difficult for us as a council to change the fundamental wildlife policy of the United States. There's a lot of good movement towards ways to find out how to better fund the conservation of non-game species. But up till now, it's always pretty much been through hunting. I really look forward to more creative approaches that doesn't have to be the only way to fund it. but right now it is. And so I think it has to be considered as a tool for management. That model, the North American model of wildlife conservation and management, it's been successful up to now. It's helped us recover some populations that otherwise may have been extinct, and also help to maintain other populations like ungulates, and also to reintroduce them in some areas that maybe they've been removed. And so I do think that it's proven to be a positive contributor to conservation. Another thing that it does, one of its tenets, is to establish science as the proper tool for the development of wildlife policy. And so I think that's a really important part for us to remember as well. Regardless of the decision on the hunt, it shouldn't be done without the proper research and monitoring involved to ensure that that can be done sustainably and in a way that accounts for the particular areas socially and biologically and what exists there. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Chad.
Thanks, Heather. And I'm going to pretty much echo a lot of Jonathan's comments and agree with Carolyn and Annie. On the social tolerance and acceptability side in hunting, I agree wholeheartedly. They're all intertwined. I'll use an example, and it can be used for anything. 10% of our population in Montana is in favor for X, and 10% of our population is not in favor of X, and you've got 80% of people in the middle that really just don't care about what's going on, or maybe they care a little bit. But the question is you're never going to satisfy 100% of the population as a whole. We're not going to do that. We don't have the ability to do that as 18 people on this council. I think what we're taxed with is making sure that we're giving sound recommendations based on everything we've heard to the governor. And Caroline, what you said was spot on. It's a trust issue right now with our agencies, with FWP, with the state, with whatever it may be. And I think that's part of the disagreement with a lot of folks is people in the state of Montana like bears. They're willing to deal with bears. They're willing to accept bears on the landscapes if they're managed properly. And I think that's where we see a lot of discourse right now. And I know Trina would agree with me that she's coexisted with bears for years, but does she think they're managed properly? Absolutely not. And so I think that's a big portion of what we have to look at and give these agencies the recommendations and the abilities to manage bears properly, and hunting is a portion of that. And I had right in my notes, Jonathan, the North American conservation model. It's been proven for the last 80 years, 90 years, 100 years. It works. And it is based on science, and it's based on the fact that, Montana, or excuse me, the United States and Canada are the only two countries in the world that run with this model, and look at our wildlife populations in both of those countries. So, it gets back to science, and we're never, as this council, going to come to a consensus on hunting. But I think, in my opinion, hunting has to be a tool that FWP, USF, whoever it may be, that has to be in their toolkit. We have to be able to hunt or manage a hunt for bears going forward. And I'm going to drop my soapbox.
Thanks, Chad. Chuck.
Sorry, I'm struggling with my mute there. Most of you on the council know that one of my primary concerns has been and still is, as a land manager responsible for a large ownership with quite a vigorous population of grizzly bears, liability is a huge concern. We have lots and lots of visitors, lots from the area, but lots from outside the area. And I just, I know in my heart that we need to have hunting as a management tool. I mean, it's been utilized for years and years on all species. And I had written down that I was going to throw out the North American Wildlife Conservation Model, but Jonathan and Chad already echoed it, but it's a proven model to follow. I don't think there's any question that there's the social tolerance and the role of hunting is interrelated. We can't separate those. It's a tough issue for us to tackle, but I know as sure as I'm sitting here, and I fall back to on a lot of my experience, both as a land manager and in the number of years I served on the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation board. We were constantly dealing with this similar surveys, wildlife management issues, the interaction of ungulates, predators, humans on a national and a North American level. And it needs to be a tool. And I know there's a real struggle with people that have a philosophical, problem with hunting, but if we really want to make the right recommendations, that hunting has to be a tool. Thanks for giving me my 2 cents.
Thanks, Chuck. Cole.
Hey, I'm going to pass to Annie to let her finish up and then I can go.
Okay. Annie.
Yep. Thank you, Cole. So I was talking social tolerance, and I don't know quite when I cut off. The wind blew. It's really windy here and we lost internet. But going to hunting, I found it really insightful to hear from British Columbia last week and Kodiak, and to compare Montana to those two entities. And I learned a lot about those, and that we in Montana will never be the same as Kodiak. And we can never, in my lifetime and children's lifetimes, expect a hunt on the scale of Kodiak with 1,500 bears a season. That's huge. And so the revenue brought in, that was really interesting to hear that as a state with the amount of tags that FWP had set a few years ago when they wrote up a example hunt for grizzly bears. It was like 6 tags. And so that was not a large revenue compared to what Kodiak can bring in. And so that was just great information to have and kind of to put into where we've been brainstorming with recommendations for different funding and how, if we do in the future, what we could recommend. But I agree, and I echo what everybody has said, that I think not right now and not tomorrow, but in the future, that Montana will have to come up with a sustainable hunt that's managed and scrutinized and really dialed in, and that it's not static, but it's dynamic, and it can change as the population of grizzlies changes, and that it really takes into account females with cubs, the connectivity zones where these bears are. But I agree that as we've seen the population increase, that hunting should be an option. Right now, it's still tied up with litigation and bears are threatened. And so now is not the time for that. But I am in support of a small, well-managed hunt for grizzlies in the future. My experience with grizzly bear hunters in Alaska is hearing their stories and seeing them and seeing hunters in general. Coming from a hunting family, hunters are conservationists through and through. They are the ones out on the land daily, looking at it, seeing the changes and connecting with it. And so as a guide and educator, I bring people to have a one-on-one experience with animals, and hunters have been doing that themselves. And so I don't want to take away their opportunity to enjoy the outdoors in a way that they enjoy doing that. I would hope people wouldn't do that to my enjoyment of the natural world as well. So thank you. And Cole, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. I want to say a couple of things. One is for the public. all of these Zoom meetings, even though they're streamed live through YouTube, they're also recorded. And so if you missed last week's conversation around the role of hunting, you can find it recorded on the council website. And certainly, Annie, and a number of you that have spoken already, there's the question of values, and there's also the question of role, right, and of hunting. And so it is integral in terms of social acceptance and how that fits in. And also just reminding that even though this council isn't charged with listing or delisting, and understanding that right now, given that the bears are listed, that it's not an option, the governor is really thinking, and FWP is thinking long-term. And so really trying to understand how you're thinking about this, both from a values perspective and also in terms of what the role of hunting could or couldn't be, and how do you as a council begin to articulate that. And as Chad said, there are varying perspectives on this council in terms of where people stand on that. And that's reflective of the state and of the country and of the world, I'm sure. And so how do you 18 come together and start to articulate what you're saying now and flush that out a bit in writing so that it gives the governor's office something tangible to think about? So wanted to just plug that in there. Cool.
This is Cole Mannix. I live in Helena, and my family ranches in the Blackfoot Valley. And I guess our reality is that grizzly bears have changed what life is like in the Blackfoot on a daily basis for some people. We have respect for the animals. I mean, I was wonderful to see the video of the sow and 4 cubs. I mean, we truly enjoy grizzly bears. I guess I would say I can't personally imagine hunting a grizzly bear. I just don't have an interest. But that being said, after last week's presentation by Larry from Alaska and Garth from British Columbia, I think that hunting, and obviously it's a future discussion, but I think it could be used effectively as a tool in Montana, either in the relatively near future, when it was first established as a very conservative season, as I think the current FWP plan is very conservative and reflects that, or at some point if population management becomes a need, I think it could be used in that way too, as Larry presented. And my another take home from that presentation is that it's not a very effective tool for reducing conflicts with livestock, for example. I think it was interesting. Another interesting point from last year from last week that was pointed out to us is that folks' spiritual beliefs can align on the hunting side, pro-hunting side, or on the anti-hunting side. For some people, it's part of their spiritual beliefs to be able to hunt. And I think it's just important to point out. And I also just wanted to say, I respect the role that hunter funding and hunter interest plays in conservation. And others have mentioned that North American model. And I would point out that, ranchers and foresters also contribute a great deal of their personal means and make personal sacrifices for wildlife conservation. And so I guess one of the points that I'd like to add with today's discussion is that neither social tolerance nor biological suitability addresses a key additional point, which is that society's working lands have to stay economically viable amidst all the support that they provide for wildlife. And that's challenged, and it goes beyond just personal, how easy it is to live with grizzly bears, but it's whether these operations, which are critical, can support wildlife into the future. More bears in more places puts additional pressure on those working lands that society depends on. So I think that's all I have. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Cole. Darren.
Hi, Darren Boss, Havre, Montana. Thanks everybody for going ahead of me, because that makes our jobs to say ditto a lot easier. But I guess a little bit to Cole's point is I probably would put in for a grizzly bear tag in Montana if we ever have that hunt. Would I see that happening next year, or in the next few years? I'm guessing not, but I can always run home to the science of it, and looking at the science from what we heard from experts in Alaska and in British Columbia, and looking at the science and what Ken presented and the Fish and Wildlife and Parks presented last year, is that with several hurdles and intervention steps, that the population is not drastically affected by those limited hunting modes, right? And so I keep coming back to the science to behind that. And we've been 9 months or 8 months getting here, and we finally have to try and figure out how people safety, the social component of that works into just the science and science of it. And it's always a difficult and the hard part of integrating that. And so I appreciate Chad's comments about the extremes on each side and Carolyn's in the middle fact. So I run home to the science. North American model is really important also, and I do appreciate that too. So understanding that it probably won't be a management hunt. It's just not going to happen. I think everybody's in agreement with that, that's just not the options, and doesn't seem to be effective. So that's kind of where I'm falling on the hunting component. On the social component, I think the thing we really also need to think about, private lands are very, very important to wildlife populations throughout the state of Montana. And we need to kind of wrap our heads around that component, those social components, not just public lands or those. So that's kind of where I fall. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Darren. Erin.
Hi, Erin Edge, again, based in Missoula. There's a lot. I think coming back to the tolerance piece, I think, kind of taking all of the discussion that we've had and even going back to funding discussions and all of it, I think what we've seen is social tolerance is variable. I mean, even variable within our groups, which is what Annie pointed out. And I don't know that we can nail down that. I mean, it sounds like even in science, there's disagreement. And so I don't know that it's our role to define that. And I struggle with even that thought of us trying to define it, but recognizing it, I think is important, and recognizing the variability of how that might change geographically, how that might change demographically, is something that we as a council need to take into consideration. I think another thing that stood out to me in today's presentation on social tolerance was that importance of that one-on-one relationship. And I think that comes back to some of the things that we've been talking about. How do we, Annie, that's adorable, by the way, but how do we support the agency, and how do we, as far as my organization goes, or for other folks out there, how do we create that trust and build those relationships, and support the agency being able to do that, whether that's more bear managers in places where bears are showing up, or whether that's an education and outreach department of some degree. But it sounded like that was really important, and that has continued to come up in all of our conversations. And so that stood out to me. I also think it's an opportunity right now in Montana to look at some of the social dimensions of bears going back to places where they haven't been in a long time. So you have this, single point of time data in this survey now. Come back to that in I don't know how long a time, but you have the opportunity, I think, to relook at that data later. And I think that will be important to see how does this idea of social tolerance, or how do perspectives change over time as grizzly bears move into areas they haven't been in a long time. So I just saw that as an opportunity. Around the hunting issue, I think the presentations we saw were very helpful in kind of framing my thoughts around hunting. I will point out they're very different, right? And I think Annie pointed some of that out too, and the number of bears, the connected landscape of bears. And so I agree with Chad that I don't know that we'll come to consensus on hunting in our specific group, but I do think that there are some discussions we can have around if a hunting season were to occur sometime in the future. One, that's going to be part of the management agency to reach out. It's going to be a large public comment process, heavily involved with lots of different outreach type opportunities for the public, and then commission decision making. And so there's going to be that whole process aside. But are there places the council can discuss if that is to occur? What are some things that we see through our experiences should be in place? So I feel like the discussion for us could be more fruitful around those ideas rather than to have or not to have a hunt, I guess.
Thanks, Erin. Great point in highlighting where your discussion as a council can go, and that is certainly reflected in the governor's executive order, which again for the public can be found on the council website, in terms of the role of hunting being one of the 7 topic areas that you are charged with to come up with recommendations. And so certainly, as we've heard over the last several months as you guys have been meeting, it is a values question, and there isn't one answer, but how can you all as a council come up with recommendations on what that role could be if there was such a hunt established. So Greg, you're up next. Can't hear you, even though it looks like you're not on mute. Still can't hear you. Looks like you're trying. Still can't hear you. Can see you. Maybe if you unplug your headset and try it that way. Nope. All right, we'll have to come back to you once you figure out the audio. Dylan or Charlie, unless you have other tips for him to try. We heard you earlier.
Greg, when you click on the audio, there you go. Well, if you click on the audio button on the bottom left, Greg, where there's the microphone and there's the caret button, press that and see if it says select a microphone, and try to see your desktop or the speakers on your computer, if that's an option.
It was working earlier for him.
Well, I can try to troubleshoot you through the chat, Greg, if you and I can chat there, and then we could keep moving in if that works.
Thanks. Thanks, Dylan. Heath.
Yeah, Heath Martinell from Dell, Montana. My family ranches in Southwest Montana. And I guess when I think about these things, as far as social tolerance and hunting, like everybody has said, they do go kind of hand in hand. When I think about our personal ranch and being on the landscape, I kind of have to reiterate what Brett said earlier about our family view is all wildlife has a place on the landscape. But like Brett also said, you know, safety is very important for our family, and not only our family, but those who are on the land, whether it's employees or visitors, as well as our livestock. And to kind of go along with also what Cole mentioned earlier too about working lands, to me, to build social tolerance, we're going to need to figure out how we can make working on the land and having grizzly bears, whatever economic impact that is, mitigated through some type of, whether it's a livestock loss, or also I just think having managers and wildlife services, having them, enough of them on the landscape where when there's a problem, that people can get a response in a timely manner. I think that would go a long ways. Getting back to the presentation we heard last time, especially from Larry, talking about Alaska, and he mentioned that they don't really have a livestock loss program, but they also don't have a whole lot of livestock in comparison to Montana. And he also said that every Alaskan resident, depending on where they live in geographic regions, but they got 1 to 2 bear permits per year. And I realize we're talking a lot different populations in Montana, but just the fact that residents can deal with problems if they have them, I think the way Larry talked goes a long ways towards public acceptance with any issues that they are having, if they know that they have the chance or the opportunity to handle that when it's happening. I guess to me, building social acceptance or tolerance, a lot of it is giving the people who are most directly affected a chance to have a little bit more to say about how those things happen. Going with hunting, I think hunting would be something that we would be very beneficial, not only to the state of Montana, but also I think our citizens and our hunting citizens. I'm not really much of a hunter, but I think that hunting is something that we need to consider, and a managed hunt I think would be very would be able to. I think our bear population could easily sustain a well-managed hunt. So, thank you.
Thanks, Heath. Cameron or Greg, do we have you back yet?
You know what? Here, actually, I got Greg on my phone. So Greg and I are talking. I'm going to put you on speaker. Greg, do you mind just re-saying that so the group can hear it? All right, try to speak. Can you hear that, group?
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, you're good to go, Greg.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes. Thanks, Dylan.
One thing that's never been brought up and stuff is, we talk about social acceptance, but nobody has addressed what the financial acceptance is. I've lost tens of thousands of dollars to the grizzly bear. I'm very social accepting of them, but I just need somebody that would be a little bit financial accepting of it, of that responsibility to help me out and help people like Trina out and Kristen and other people in agriculture. We make up 60% of the land ownership, but we get nobody's willing to help out much. I mean, the livestock loss board helps out a little bit, but we were sitting there with a crop damage that was just unbelievable. And unless you saw it firsthand, nobody would believe it. And then back to the hunting part of it. I think we can discuss that all day long, and we'll never come to a consensus. We get a little closer together and stuff. But with the program the state had for 2018, as conservative as that was, and all the input and experts that we've heard from for the last 9 months, I think the state has that program pretty well in place, where we should go and what should happen, and we've got to count on them to do the right thing, and we know they will. They've shown it in past situations and stuff. So that's, I guess, enough out of me, and we'll move on. Thank you.
And just for the viewers to make sure they know, that's Greg Schock from St. Ignatius who was talking there.
Thanks, Dylan. Thanks, Greg, for being creative around that, and certainly throwing out a new term of financial acceptance is certainly something that you all have been talking about, is how to undertake and provide thoughtful and realistic recommendations around how these activities can be funded and how your recommendations can be funded. So that is certainly something that's at the forefront for all of you. Cameron, you're up next.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Cameron Kelsey. We own and operate a guest ranch and outfitting business in Southwest Montana. And I don't know that I have anything real new to add, just kind of echoing a lot of what everybody else has said. I guess in the social side of things, as others have stated, trust is going to be a huge portion of that. And I know from a personal experience that one-on-one relationship or working with the agency partners or whoever is particularly handling the scenario is very helpful. And I don't know that we'll ever be able to accomplish a one-on-one interaction with everybody in the state. But I think it ties back into what Cole brought up with the private lands and working with those landowners and people that do have a financial stake in it as well. Like Greg brought up, we can all be socially accepting of something or have some sort of level of acceptance of it, but it is a financial situation as well with livestock or crops or just the land itself. So I think, trying to develop, whether it's having more biologists or more bear managers on the landscape to help work with people on a one-on-one basis and develop that trust so that we can accept the bear being there and still make a living doing what we're doing. As far as hunting, everybody's touched, or not everybody, but a lot of touched on the North American model of conservation. I think that's a very science-based and proven model that has worked. And so to not consider hunting, I think would be foolish or not. I don't think that we should rule it out. Is it going to happen this year or next year? I don't think so. But I think the program that the FWP put forward was extremely conservative and did not, I don't think it would have any impacts on the population, nor do I think it would solve any conflicts or, anything like that. I don't think that's the point of that and the numbers that would be hunted. It's not going to reduce conflicts or human interactions or anything like that. But I don't think we should take it off the table. As others have said, I doubt we'll ever come to a consensus on the hunting. But I think the model that they have the FWP has put forward is extremely conservative and would be just fine in the populations that we have currently. And I think our populations would continue to grow even with the minimal hunting. So I guess that's probably all I have to say. I am interested in seeing those results from that survey. I think that'll be helpful to kind of gain some knowledge from that. And I also agree with Annie's point that maybe we should all take the survey and then we can kind of see where we all stand as a council. So I guess those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron. It would be helpful to see if people are interested or if council members are interested in taking the survey. And so you can either do a thumbs up or stick it in the chat. And Cecily, I might ask you how best that would work. Would that they then send those to you to be collated, or should we have the Metcalfs help with that? Or do you have any thoughts about that? That has come up a couple times.
You can certainly send them to me. I'd be happy to compile them just in a very, simple way. Just say how many people responded each of the ways. Or I could work with the Metcalfs to do that as well. They might have all the graphs set up to kind of put them in a reasonable way so you could visualize them. But I think that would be good. One of the questions we might think about in terms of the council members taking the survey is, do you want to do it anonymously or do you want to put your name on it?
So we can continue that conversation. I want to make sure we get through everyone, but sort of wanted to throw it out there so that we didn't lose it. But yeah, thanks, Cecily. All right, Lawrence.
Okay, hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Hello? Hello?
Yep, you're good,
I can
Lawrence.
hear you.
Sorry, I couldn't get my mute button fast enough. So yeah, we can hear you.
All right, I'll give it a shot. As far as hunting, I'm not a hunter. I haven't hunted since I was a kid, and I don't really see myself hunting even into the future. But I am very supportive of hunting, really all game animals, and that would include grizzly bears. I think hunting is a sport. Well, it's a lot of things, but it's a sport that gets people out, that gets families out. I've got a lot of families that come and hunt, and their kids, they start them as young as they can, both boys and girls, and a lot of their wives hunt, and it becomes, you know, a family event type of thing. So I'm very supportive of it, and I think that we should hunt grizzly bears along with the black bears and the deer and the elk and lions. We've got all those things on the ranch, and we have hunting of all of them every year. As to it's kind of a social acceptance thing, but we really do need to discuss where grizzly bears should be and where they shouldn't be. I mean, I know that a lot of people believe that they should be wherever they want to go. Well, I don't agree with that for a lot of reasons. One being social acceptance, another being management capabilities. I mean, we've got such few bear managers out there. They're kind of handling it now. But as the population grows, we're going to have to add to that. And especially if we get an awful lot of bears out in what, you know, in the areas between the recovery areas, we're going to need more and more help. And I don't know that we're going to get it. I mean, that's become somewhat of a political thing as far as getting enough money out of the government to hire capable bear managers to be in locations where they're needed. And so I think that we do need to think about, for example, Eastern Montana. I mean, I talk to people from Eastern Montana every chance I get, and I've yet to find one person that says, yeah, we want grizzlies out here. In fact, usually the answer is absolutely not, or something even stronger than that. As to socially acceptable, I think that that's an extremely important thing that we need to talk about. I just talked about some of the reasons regarding Eastern Montana, and also having enough people to take care of quickly problems that come up. And what's also been said about, you know, livestock damage, crop damage, we haven't talked much about that, especially the crop damage side of it, but that's a real issue as well. And I think that we need to really think about, is it, or even should it be, socially acceptable? In my mind, it should never be socially acceptable to have a grizzly bear in your home. And by home, I mean your home includes your house, and includes your yard where the kids play in the summertime and often in the wintertime too. But it should never be socially acceptable to have a grizzly bear in your yard, or in any city or town, or in any farmers or ranchers farmstead, or close to rural schools or rural churches, or in campgrounds even. I think that we really need to try to push for more research in how to train grizzlies not to be in those places. And I know that, you know, we can put a little electric fence here and a little electric fence there, but that's not sufficient for some of these for some of these issues. And I've been thinking about that, and I'll submit that in writing to the council here probably before our next meeting. Anyway, that's kind of where I'm at. I'm very, very concerned about social acceptability, and I think we got a long ways to go there. And I guess that'll do it.
Thanks, Lawrence. I know that this has certainly been a topic you've felt really strongly about and have continued to advocate that we make sure that we spend time on. And so I'm glad that we're doing that today. And I'm glad that you've reiterated your points and shared what you have. We've got 4 more of you to go within 15 minutes. So I'm going to go to Michelle.
Hi there. This is a big topic, and it's a lot to discover. And if I can read these notes, I will tell you what I think. I've been scribbling, and there's a lot. First off, social tolerance. I really want to focus on that trust and that one-on-one relationship. We need more bear managers and bear management specialists to create those relationships, and that's a funding issue. I also think we need to teach livestock owners to take the correct evidence that will show that it's a depredation, because oftentimes if it takes longer for those specialists to get there to determine that it's a depredation, they would have that information and they would also feel a part of the decision. And that also is a funding issue, I think, too. I feel like in the past, or in our situation now, FWP is more of a reactive model when it comes to bears coming to an area and conflicts beginning. They haven't prepared the area before it happens. And I think pushing a more proactive model, which also means funding, more people on the ground, more people ahead of the bears, is really important to create that social tolerance. That understanding of the ecological importance of the bear, but also understanding both the financial interests, both positive and negative, of the bear. I guess, yeah, that's my thought on social tolerance. I think that would be the way to bring it together and have more social tolerance for the bears on the landscape. As far as hunting is,
just to clarify, Michelle, when you're talking about FWP being more proactive as opposed to reactive, are you talking about in terms of grizzly expansion, such as into the Bitterroot and getting there?
Yes, into new areas. As they move into new areas, I feel like it's been reactive versus proactive. And I think that it would be great if that changed. It would help the social tolerance idea of it. As far as hunting is concerned, I've thought a lot about that since our last presentation. And I look back on the executive order and I'm wondering where it falls into our mandate. Hunting does not increase human safety and it does not reduce conflicts. And it doesn't necessarily conserve the bears. I mean, right now we have a connectivity situation. If we really are going to go towards Cecily's model of that meta population, we need that connectivity. And I think hunting, especially when the numbers outside the DMA are not counted towards mortality, that we will lose that ability to connect these subpopulations. I also worry about hunting. There are studies that have showed that poaching increases with hunting, which is another factor that'll add to the mortality. I think it's premature to talk about hunting at this point, just because we don't have the 10,000 bears that BC has, the 3,000 bears on Kodiak, or the 30,000 bears in Alaska. So those are my thoughts on hunting, especially with connectivity. So maybe we need to have that discussion as well. And I'm looking through my notes to see if I've missed anything else. Oh, I wanted to point out that Montana had the ability to hunt bears under the ESA from the time they were listed until 1991. And that was taken away. And my understanding it was taken away is because the numbers were going down with that hunting. So it was stopped in order to conserve the bears. I just wanted to mention that as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michelle. Nick.
Great. So this is a good discussion. I know a lot's been said here. I just wanted to point out that addressing what Trina said about people with livestock, if you look at the survey that they did, they worked to address, they asked questions about whether people do raise livestock and what their interactions are with bears. So I do think that that community is represented in this. And I just think that's an important point, and that's all part of their data collection. As far as hunting, I mean, it's been said, we feel, our model of wildlife conservation is the most successful in the world. And I think if you look at the presentations we had last week, Montana, any future hunt would more resemble British Columbia than Alaska, just based on sheer numbers. But that said, I hope everybody in this council reads Chris Servine's comments, because none of us are, hunting will not be a conflict reduction tool, is based on the numbers that we would use. But I guess I disagree with the people on this council who say we shouldn't be talking about this now. I mean, this is exactly when we need to be talking about it, because it's one of the charges the governor gave us. So, and I do think, and I heard this when those of you who know Gary Wolf, when he was on the Fish and Wildlife Commission, he heard from numerous hunters. He brought this up. We were having this discussion 4 years ago. You will see more broad support from the hunting community when there are grizzly bears, when there is a measured grizzly bear hunt. And most hunters know they're never going to draw the tag. I mean, look at the numbers that we would be talking about for a take. It'd be an extremely limited hunt based on the mortality limits set in that Yellowstone recovery plan. We're talking a take of maybe 2 to 5 bears. So, and again, most hunters know they're never going to draw the tag, but that's not the point. It's hopefully, and this is why I was hoping there'd be some social science on this, to measure whether there'd be more support for more grizzly bears on the landscape in more places. And I'll just say, I mean, you look at the mountain lions and you look at the hound hunters, you see broad support for the houndsmen for mountain lions. I mean, every species of wildlife in our country that is valued by hunters has thrived with proper sound management. So with that, I just wanted to give 3 suggestions that this council could make to improve, which what I think was an excellent hunting package that FWP proposed, which was challenged in court, and FWP won on that. The first off is require anybody who takes a grizzly bear to eat the meat. We do that with black bears. Why not grizzlies? They do it in Alaska. Secondly, some type of video to talk about the cultural significance for the handful of people who draw the tag, the cultural significance of grizzly bears for Native Americans. And, some of the litigants on the grizzly bear delisting in the Yellowstone, many of them were tribes. And I think it's important to recognize how important that species is to them. And then lastly, this is tailored on a bill that we got through in 2013. Grizzly bear hunting will never resemble wolf hunting. We all know that. It will not be general licenses. It will be very limited. So make it some type of $20 non-refundable fee to apply. We do that now with moose and bighorn sheep and stuff, so that it at least generates some revenue to help with grizzly bear management, which we know is going to be a huge challenge into the future. And lastly, I'll just leave with this. I've brought this up before, but we talk a lot about the need for more resources. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has 6 wolf-only wolf specialists. And frankly, I think if we could propose converting those jobs into carnivore management specialists, because I agree with the people, we need to be more proactive in the management to prevent conflicts in new areas where grizzly bears are showing up, change their job duties, because, you know, we've been successfully hunting wolves for well over a decade now, for a decade now. And I will say that it's a very aggressive hunt, but wolves can sustain that. Grizzly bears won't be able to. So I think we need to recognize, as former Chairman Vermillion said, that there will be a grizzly bear hunt in Montana someday. It will be extremely measured, extremely conservative, but hopefully it shows that that just like every other species, including black bears, mountain lions, and gray wolves, that if hunters are engaged, we'll be successful. So those are my thoughts right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. And I hope you make sure to get those recommendations into the next draft of you guys' framework, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. We've still got Robin and then Trina. So Robin, you're up.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it is great being almost the last person. I can say ditto to a lot of things, so I'll try to make it quick. I know we have a lot to talk about. I would just start out, I'll just start with hunting. I agree with Chad and Aaron and Greg. Caroline, I think too, said this. I don't think we're going to reach consensus on that issue in this group, which doesn't mean we shouldn't have the conversation. I don't mean to imply that. I think it is a good conversation. One of the things that was really interesting to me, and I love hearing all our different opinions about this and how we all process information and how we hear it. The hunting presentations that we had at our last Zoom actually solidified my position about how I feel about hunting, because it really made me understand what the purpose and need for that was, or as I interpreted what I was hearing. And I was really conflicted about that. And now, based on those presentations, I have a different understanding and don't see it as this tool that it actually that needs to be in the toolbox. And the other piece, what happens with me on the hunting issue, the things that I consider about presentations I heard from the tribal folks, and then the private one-on-one conversations I've had with tribal members who made me, did a beautiful job of helping me understand the significance of grizzly bear in their spiritual practices and culture. I'm not comfortable, nor can I support a sporting hunt. Somebody said, yeah, a sporting animal, sporting hunt for an animal that plays such a significant spiritual part in our tribal community members. So where I was conflicted is where I always understood hunting, and I want to be really clear, I'm not an anti-hunter. We've hunted, we live in the yak, we eat game, all that. This is not about me being anti-hunting at all. But I was conflicted because I always understood that hunting was a really important management tool for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And I just got a different idea about it, about how we could meet those needs, that purpose and need that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has, that maybe hunting could meet, except, like I said, the presentation showed me a whole different way of looking at it. So I'll just say that I think that our council discussions and conversations we've been having since we started meeting last fall have really come up with some innovative ideas and potential recommendations for how we could strengthen the tools that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks needs to manage the bodies of the bears. And Trina, early on in this conversation today in the chat box, she shared a text that someone, I think from her area, had shared about their issue about management of bears. And I think this kind of gets into this point of, let's strengthen those tools that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks already has. How can we make them better? How can we give them more bear managers on the ground? How can we be making sure that they're dealing with the conflicts in the way that need to be dealt with, and on and on and on, which I could go on about that, which a lot of that has already been covered. And I would just say, I think Michelle made great points about, the hunting issue based on what came out of those presentations, so I won't repeat those. And I just would say that it's a great conversation. I'm glad we're having it. I think that while we won't be able to reach consensus on this, I do think that this council has come up with some really innovative ideas about funding sources, other management tools that could be very helpful for fish, wildlife, and parks going forward. And I think I'll just stop there.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Robin. Trina, almost. We've got Kristen. And then Trina. Hi, Kristen. Do you want to introduce yourself quickly before you start?
Hi, I'm Kristen Kipp. I live in northwestern Montana, north of Browning on the Blackfeet Reservation. I am a cattle producer and a bunch of other things. I am also an avid hunter. So I'll address the social piece first. I think everybody's really done a good job talking about, I'm just going to touch on things because there's been a lot that's already been said that I really think is important. The two issues are super intertwined, and I do think that there was a couple people brought up trust, and especially having good management does help with trust. I'm just looking at my notes, so bear with me. Public participation. The thing, and I've said this like, I don't know how many times, but I do think you can be too socially tolerant or too socially acceptable. I see that with my own community, where it's actually not a beneficial thing. I don't think that being socially tolerant does equal success. I think it's important. It's something that needs to be addressed. But the more socially acceptable you are, or the more socially tolerant you are, does not mean greater success for the grizzly bear or for people or whatever. That's about it. Who was it? Greg talked about, it's not really on our, wasn't really on one of our issues right now, but Greg talked about financial acceptance. There is a huge financial toll for people that live on the landscape, no matter whether they're in agriculture or they just live in a rural environment where grizzlies are. Just for example, I'm just going to throw this out there. So we just recently bought a couple Curlian bear dogs, and that was over $6,000 just to have dogs to protect my kids and my family. And so there's so many different things besides the loss of livestock, the financial loss to your crops. There's lots of other things that come into play. And then going on the hunting thing, I agree with there's a lot of people that said that they think that hunting needs to be in the toolbox, whether that's used, whatever the time that is used, it needs to be in there. We shouldn't take it out. And just my background, I grew up hunting. I grew up probably almost completely on game meat. Both my mom and my dad were big hunters. It's a way of life. I don't eat bear meat. That's a spiritual practice. I don't think that I would ever put in for a grizzly bear hunt or a tag if there were to be a hunt, except for if there were a cultural reason that I needed to do that. And Nick brought up his 3 suggestions, which I thought were really great. It was good to have those specifics, but I do disagree with the first one just because there would be a reason, like in my situation or other people's circumstance, that maybe need that would use that tag for a very good reason, but don't or cannot eat the meat. And I really loved what Annie had to say. She talked about hunters being the biggest conservationists. And I think that people in agriculture or people that live on the landscape are huge conservationists as well, not just hunters. And sorry, I'm a little scattered, but I did want to address one thing about hunting not improving human safety. And I have to say that I disagree. There's been so many instances personally that I've experienced, and I know of other people that live along the Rocky Mountain front where they have experienced threats to human safety, huge threats. And I think that if there wasn't such a fear, it wasn't, despite the law, people, I feel, this is my experience from talking with people that are in the same situation, that live where there's a high number of grizzly bears, people do not want to take matters into their own hands, whether they are in the right or not. People are terrified of protecting themselves or their families. And I do think that, you know, I can't count how many times that legally, if I wanted to, if I felt comfortable, that I could have went out and removed a bear for whatever it was doing. And legally that would have been okay. But so I just, that's not really coming out very good. But my point is I do think that maybe it might not improve human safety on a huge level, but it would help people that are in my situation maybe feel or be more apt to actually take action instead of living for years with terrible interactions with habituated aggressive grizzlies, with a whole slew of other problems. And I really don't think that people understand until you experience it. And oh, the other thing, so when I first came into this, I was really against, I shouldn't say I was against, I was very conflicted about, and I said this on our last call, I was very conflicted about the hunting issue because I have my own spiritual and cultural beliefs. I do believe that it can be a great tool. I actually, despite probably not ever eating grizzly meat, I am for hunting grizzly bears. I do think, just like any other species, they need to be managed. I'm in support of, somebody talked about about it being a statewide issue, and none of these issues are statewide. They are, but they aren't. All these areas are so unique. We have different populations. There's so many things that come along with each area, whether it's the GYE or the NCDE or wherever. So I know for the areas that do have recovered populations, I think it's a good thing about it.
Thanks, Kristen. Trina, saving the best for last.
Okay, so I'm going to be quick because I want to give some of my time to Mike Meidel if he's still here, hopefully. So I think you guys all know how I feel about social tolerance and social acceptance, and that we are actually living here in spite of the bears, not happily with them. I also think that a hunting season is absolutely important. I don't have a problem with trophy hunting. I don't have a problem with management hunting. I think it's going to be a really useful tool, and I think that we should trust our FWP to manage that hunt just like they manage the rest of the hunts in this state. Am I okay with grizzly bears being on the ranch? Yes. And maybe that's conflicting statements. I'm not okay with grizzly bears being in my yard or following us or not being afraid of us. We had 2 this morning that were literally born and raised here. I think they're 4 this year, and I recognize their faces. And they were in our yard a lot last year, but so far this is the first time we've seen them. So hopefully they learned their lesson last year. But that is where my point is coming from, is as we talk about social tolerance and social acceptance, we have to remember that the grizzly bear population is constantly changing, and therefore where the grizzly bears live is constantly changing. And so what's happening is, as these grizzly bears spill out into the prairie or into places that they haven't ever been before, people's tolerance opinions may change and will change. You know, we had the mauling last week in Dupuyer, about 5 miles from where I grew up. That bear was where bears usually aren't. And why was she there? Because she had 3 tiny babies that she couldn't have on the creek where she usually is, because they weren't safe down there, because there's so many other bears down there. So I just want to make a point that we have to remember that this is a fluid conversation, and just because somebody feels a certain way today doesn't mean they're not going to change their mind in a month after they've had a bear in their yard and experienced it for themselves. That being said, where was the bear? Which bear, Michelle? Can't hear you.
The one you just discussed that happened just recently. The
mauling?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that was right outside of Dupuyer. Like, I don't know, half a mile out of Dupuyer, maybe. So anyways, and Mike can touch on that too, but I wanted to have Mike to have a chance to talk about hunting, because he was here when we had a hunting season before and experienced the benefits of it. So I just wanted him to be able to talk about that. So go ahead, Mike.
Mike, if you just want to introduce yourself
Okay.
to the publics.
Yes, I'm Mike Madel. I work as a grizzly bear management biologist for Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the state. I've worked with bears for 40 years now this year. And the perspective I think that I had talked with Trina and Chad and a few others about is the idea of limited nature, limited entry hunting, but specifically how, from my experience, so I worked while we had a hunting season with the department for 10 years, up until 1991. Region 4 was responsible for implementing a number of different hunting seasons that were unique. And some of you touched on that. We actually had targeted hunting of specific bears, which I certainly don't support. And I have no interest myself personally in hunting large carnivores. I am an avid deer and elk hunter, but I'm not interested in hunting bears. And it's difficult sometimes to deal with the situation of hunting bears, but there is a strong tie-in, and it would be nice to see a social survey tie that in a little bit more, because when we had hunting season, I entirely work out on private land. It's all agriculture. It's ranching. Ranchers aren't interested in hunting bears. Very few are, but most are more willing to have bears inhabit their lands if there is a hunting season. Why is that? I'm actually not sure, but I think maybe a survey would help to get to that. And I do know that when we had limited entry hunting seasons with, well, just as Nick mentioned, there's always going to be a tight female subquota. There's going to be a tight quota no matter how you do it. But the truth is, hunting is just another management tool for the state to use in managing grizzly bears into the future. I respect everybody's opinion on this. I really do. I understand Caroline's there about hunting seasons, but I do know that we could, the truth is the state could carefully manage a hunting season out on private lands. We could never even need to hunt them in the PCA and still meet that quota by having a limited entry grizzly bear hunting season out on the fringes. You could even avoid the connectivity areas if there's concern about connectivity areas by having specific bear hunting management zones that are way out on the fringes of private land areas. They probably won't be on the tribal lands. They would be out on private lands, and it might even be in what we consider the Zone D area where bears would be hunted. And I do know that there would be a lot of support by ranchers to provide hunting. You could use a really limited entry spring season where hunters are primarily hunting male bears, restricting females. We'll always have a restriction of the hunting of any female bears with offspring. And the one good thing about season structure is there's a lot of science in it. Now, I agree with many of you that hunting probably will have very little effect on human safety. But what many of the research studies haven't shown is within the nature of a limited entry grizzly bear hunting season, how that actually can reduce potential conflicts out on private lands. If a hunting season is targeted to private lands and you're looking at maybe just the harvest of 2 or 3 bears, like as in 1991, where we identified specific hunting, there was 50 permitted hunters. It was a random draw. There's a certain percentage of out-of-state hunters and in-state hunters. Well, 3 male bears were harvested in 1991 in the spring. It was a 5-week season, as I mentioned to you earlier, between the 1st of April until mid-May. And 2 of those bears, 2 of the adult males, were identified as conflict bears. One was a 21-year-old male that was actively involved in calf depredations. Now, if you look at numbers, statistically, large numbers, that does tend to wash out in research studies. But when you look at private land areas on the fringes, without considering hunting bears, let's say on national forests or federal lands, you could in fact have an effect on decreasing the potential for conflicts to occur within a given year or into the future. And I just wanted to address that, realizing Nick had some good points that it's always going to be a very limited hunt season kind of tool. And Larry Van Dale is a good friend of mine. We'll never have a hunting season like they have up in Kodiak or any place else. It would be more like BC, but maybe even more restricted in nature. And there's a lot of science and flexibility that can go into the hunting of grizzly bears, just like other conflict prevention management tools. Or if you look at it just as a way of mortality, I know the concept isn't, very strongly supported by a lot of conservation communities, but the truth is that it's just another management tool, and it could be pretty effective out on private lands. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. It's helpful to hear from you and your experience. And we've got about 10 minutes left. And so what I want to share is I did just check in with Dylan, and we've had a number of public comments come in, but no public questions. So we don't need, there isn't a question that we need as a council to address. So just wanted to let you guys know that Dylan has been paying attention to the public comment portal, and you guys will be able to read those after the meeting. So thank you all for sharing your perspective. I know that a number of you over the last couple of meetings have really wanted to hear where each other stands and where your thoughts are around social acceptance, social tolerance, the role of hunting, and that these are difficult issues. And so it's putting you guys on the spot to share where you're standing right now. And I really appreciate the vulnerability and the honesty and transparency that each of you have demonstrated this morning. So thank you for that. I want to move on to a couple of logistical items that we've got left here in these last 10 minutes to talk about. And certainly this conversation isn't over. This is a conversation that will continue. It's really just begun in terms of hearing where each of you are. So don't want you or the public to think that we're wrapping this up nice and neatly, because it's certainly not. We're just starting. So as the agenda continues to come out for the meetings moving forward, we'll make sure to make some space for this as you guys are requesting and needing. So speaking of which, the writing team, and just for the public to provide some perspective around this, a couple of things. One is that if you've signed in late, this live stream is being recorded, so you'll be able to go back and watch the whole thing if you missed pieces of it. In addition, council members' bios are posted on the website, and our last meetings were also recorded that were on video, so you can view those as well. In the last several meetings, the council has been working in 4 randomly assigned working groups since the January meeting, and they've been working on putting on paper some of their brainstorming sessions and emerging ideas. And so you can go back to the January, February, March, and we'll post the latest iteration here in the next, either today or on Monday, in terms of their progression in articulating and starting to synthesize their emerging ideas as per the executive order. And so if you go back to January's document, it'll look really messy. It's really hard to follow, but we're wanting to really share the process and the transparency of the brainstorming ideas of the council. And where we are now, to just jump to the present, is that last meeting, they talked about establishing a writing team. And so last meeting last March, not last week when we were specifically talking about the role of hunting. So a couple of weeks ago, they established a writing team where there was one person representing each of the working groups to consolidate the 4 working group documents. And their target date was April 15th, which thank you guys very much for the hard work that you all put into consolidating this document. And the consolidation was not edited in any way. It was really to go through and look at where was there literal exact redundancy. So that part was deleted and pieces were moved around to fall under different topic areas. And so that was sent out to the council on Wednesday for you guys to take a look at. And the request from the writing team was that you stay in your 4 working groups. So I know at the March meeting, there was discussion around moving into 2 working groups, but the writing team really felt that given their process and going through the document again and really looking at each line item, it was really helpful to go through that in a smaller group to make sure that there was clarity and understanding behind each one of those emerging ideas. I guess at this point, I should turn it over to members of the writing group if you want to explain that any further and share how your process has gone. So that would be Aaron and Caroline and Jonathan and Michelle.
I can talk a little bit about it and then pass it on to whoever else. I think so. So it was long process, and I think that's kind of one of the reasons why I was thinking it might be better to go back into our smaller groups, because even just as the writing team going through it, just to kind of delete things that were redundant or move things around, it was quite the process, and we had hours of discussion. So just, you know, thinking about going back into the small groups, I know we had wanted to try and consolidate those. I do think it'll be helpful to have better discussion around these. And I think we were also hoping that it would allow us to have more in-depth discussion on some of the sticking points. So you guys will see at the bottom of the document topics for consideration that were pulled out. And thank you for writing those down, Jonathan, where we felt like there needs some in-depth conversation amongst council members and recognizing that we're gonna have to come back as a whole council to do this again. But at least in the small groups to kind of get some thoughts on paper on that. And I guess, Heather, I also have a question, and I don't remember if this was in the email or not. We just need to for me, I need to clarify the process moving forward. So the color coding, I didn't really quite, somebody just needs to like, let me know what that is, and then also how we're going to insert, how the groups might insert new recommendations. How we want those in a separate section, or do we want them included in the sections we already outlined? So those are just some thoughts I had moving forward.
Thanks, Erin. So a couple of things around process. One was that the recommendation was to meet next week in your 4 small working groups. And if you're able to get through the whole document, and including adding additional thoughts, which we're really encouraging at this point, and we'll talk a bit about how to do that. It could then be where the following week, groups 1 and 2 merge and groups 3 and 4 merge. And so if you have enough time next week as you're in your smaller groups, if you're ready to then merge, that would happen the following week. And really what we're hoping happens is that each of the working groups, whether that's 4 documents or 2 documents, if you're able to get into the 2 groups, that those are then available for review by the council and the support team prior to the May meeting. And so the May meeting is scheduled for May 11th, 12th, and 13th. And so the hope is that we have another document where as a council, we can take a look at where the consolidation has happened and also where the new ideas have happened. And so also in that process, taking into consideration that will then have to be consolidated again. And so it was Michelle who recommended the color coding. So what Sean and I really strongly encourage is that this consolidated document get really thoroughly fleshed out, because there are ideas here, but they're great ideas and we want them fleshed out. We want meaning behind them so that for the public and for FWP, there's a real understanding, and for each other, there's a real understanding of the context and the meaning of what those recommendations are for and what they'll accomplish. And then there's gaps in there, right? And so there's been conversation, which is why we had the discussion last week and today around the role of hunting and social acceptance. There's a lot that still needs to get addressed that hasn't been addressed in this initial document. And so it would be helpful, my suggestion would be that, that you do add to that, you add that in the sections where they're appropriate. And as Michelle on the writing team encouraged, is that you color code those. So each group chooses a color. And so that when the documents are merged and the writing team has to put those back together, it's clear where those comments were coming from. Was it group 1, group 2, group 3, or group 4? So does that help in terms of process around moving forward? And we can certainly, it would be helpful that by the end of next week, and our hope is to slot some time at the end of Friday's call to talk more about where are your working groups in this process. So today we didn't have that time allocated, but we're looking to allocate some time next week so that, which is why we were encouraging that you meet in your small working groups before next Friday, so that by Friday when we come back together as a council, we can have one of you from each of the working groups share where you are in that process. And if you can merge into 2 groups the following week, or if you need to stay in your 4 groups. So we'll get an update from you next Friday in terms of how that process is going, any adjustments that need to be made to that. So any questions or need for further clarification or anything that I missed that other members of the working group want to highlight?
Quickly, Heather, I have a question just the nuts and bolts of moving forward on this.
Yeah.
Can we rely on you to help us with our 4 groups in scheduling and with really clear directions, just articulating what you just said for each of our 4 groups, and then either a doodle or something so that we can all get our 4 groups together and with a Zoom number, just all of those logistics. Can you help us do that? And when should we expect that so that we can get something set for next week?
So Charlie gave a thumbs up. So Hill and his team will help with the doodle polling of that. I know some of you from the writing team were already reaching out to your small working groups as the liaison for that. And so if you haven't, just let us know. So I know we don't need to do that for Erin's group. So I guess let Charlie and I and Sean know if you do need help with the doodle poll for that. Charlie is going to send one out in terms of the merging of 2 groups, because that does get harder. We were hoping for those 4 small groups that you as a liaison could do that. But if you need our help, happy to do that. And I can reiterate the instructions. They were in that email earlier this week, but if there's need for more clarification on that, let me know. And I'll read that over again to make sure I didn't miss anything. So thanks, Caroline. I know we're at the noon hour. I want to provide some clarification in terms of the schedule in moving forward for you council members and also for the public. We are meeting next Friday again via Zoom. It will be live streamed. It will be from 1 to 4 p.m. on Friday, April 24th. And the topic for conversation is on livestock and agricultural compensation. So I know that that's come up a lot today. And we'll have George Edwards and Craig Glazier and Seth Wilson who will help lead that conversation. Moving forward, there has been conversation since last week around our May 11th, 12th, and 13th meeting. It has been determined that we will not be meeting in person, given the governor's stay-at-home order through April. How long that will continue to get extended, just for sake and for safety sake, because even if that gets lifted, I don't imagine that it will then be safe for 18 council members, your 2 facilitators,